speaking of that, we are joined, the man himself, international relations security analyst, Mark Sleboda. You can find Mark on Boosty under the name Real Political Mark Sleboda or just Mark Sleboda. Mark, welcome, man. How you doing today? You doing okay?
Happy Monday.
Happy
Tomorrow?
Monday indeed. And it's anniversary, Mark. We've been doing this for a year now. And as I was telling the audience, you were the first person who was with me on the show in the first iteration of the show with this particular format. And I was giving thanks to all of the audience. I was giving thanks to people like you, who was with me along this entire ride. So thank you for that. You have my thanks. And welcome to the show.
Shucks, tomorrow, as far as I'm concerned, you and I have been doing this for years.
Yes, we have. It's been what, 5 years? I think it's been like 5 years. It's been 5 years. Mark, I just showed the audience Putin's entire speech, where he was responding to Donald Trump's quote 28-point peace plan. I think it's clear at this point that the whole Naboo Seppo investigations were indeed coming from the United States to put more pressure on Zelensky, almost like an ultimatum of sorts.
Yes.
Putin pointed out also that in the Alaska summit that this deal had already been discussed even before that, and that for all intents and purposes, the U.S. was not able to get Ukraine to sign on the dotted line. Kellogg is out. Is this Minsk 3? Or what are your thoughts on it? And let me just ask as a basic, what are your thoughts on all of this?
Okay, so my original assessment of the whole Naboo affair was I didn't see a U.S. hand in it, any evidence that I was willing to consider it, but that all I was seeing was Ukrainian, the Kiev regime's domestic actors, his political opponents. It's quite clear the Europeans definitely aren't involved, but in the context of the new U.S. Renewed ceasefire plan, peace plan, that this was an attempt to put pressure on Zelensky and those closest to him in order to try to force them to the table. And there have been already repeated threats of more, right? That just over the weekend, it hasn't received as much coverage, but there was a new Naboo corruption discovery, right?
Mm-hmm.
It came right after Zelensky's initial statements that obviously, while not completely denying the Trump peace plan, like without 100% saying no, made it clear that he wasn't happy. He framed it that the Kiev regime is under enormous pressure, that they have to choose between dignity, this lovely catchphrase, the dignity, the revolution of dignity, as they call the Westback Maidan Putsch, because some people in Ukraine get dignity and others get a bullet or an artillery shell in the head. That's their conception of dignity. Almost immediately afterwards, Naboo announced a new corruption scandal breaking to do with a port privatization in Chornomorsk in the south near Odessa. And so, obviously signaling that they have enough compromise on Zelensky. They've obviously known it all the time. And now the green light, was given, right, to proceed. And then suddenly, I think what we see now is that as, shall we say, negotiations are underway between the U.S. and the Kiev regime and the EU, is that Naboo is back on yellow flashing lights, right? They're back on pause. And suddenly, everyone's forgotten that Rustem Umarov, the former defense secretary, and Yermak were directly implicated in these corruptions. And suddenly, they're back on Zelensky's chief negotiating team, sitting there with the Americans and the Europeans. So, I mean, everyone has suddenly got a get out of jail free card, at least while these discussions are ongoing. But I mean, there's already signals, potential signals that some people are reading. So the U.S. and the EU and the Kiev regime their representatives were meeting in Switzerland, in Geneva, over the weekend. They were meeting yesterday, and which would be Sunday. If you're questioning the timeline here, and there's all kinds of comments coming out of that. But we've also had a direct statement from Trump responding to a question by a journalist, and the question was, "Is this the final offer for Ukraine?" And he said, "No, I don't think it's the final offer." So people are reading a lot into that. I, again, would always hesitate on reading a lot into anything that Donald Trump says or tweets at any one given time. But people are saying that's already Trump going on, the timeline, because he set a deadline that Zelensky basically has to sign on the line by Thanksgiving. And already the Europeans are really pushing back on that. And basically what they're doing is they're trying to negotiate those supposed 28 steps. The 28 that we've seen several different versions of this peace plan come out, right?
Yeah.
Because quite obvious, what was initially discussed in Axios and then the Washington Post is not the same peace plan, or in very significant details, to what was then released on Friday by a Kiev regime member of the Rada, Goncharenko. It was released on his Telegram channel, and it was released as like photos of a document that he had been shown. So there's a question of who leaked the original, who leaked it to Axios. That was the first reporting done on it. And right. Witkoff briefly posted on social media something about it being leaked, and Kay must have leaked it. That post was Kay. That was almost immediately deleted, and right. The general consensus seems to be that was intended to be a direct message, and then it was erased as soon as he made a mistake. Now, these sorts of things are intentionally done that way all the time. So I'm a cynic. I tend to believe that but then again, Witkoff is an amateur. So who knows? Who knows? But some people are reading K as Kirill Dmitriev, the Russian supposed Putin's equivalent of Witkoff for the purposes of discussions with the U.S. He is not in the Russian government, but he is the head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund. So it's not the same thing, but it's okay to think of it, I think, as something like the head of the American Chamber of Commerce, right? Something along those lines. So, a private that works with the government and in the government's interests, in business relations all the time. And he's the one who always American speaks to Witkoff, just like Witkoff is supposed to Russian speak to the Russians, right? Because Witkoff does speak Russian, and Kirill Dmitriev does speak English, and had education in the United States, so they can speak fluently to each other. And the idea being that they're both businessmen, so they can leave the shall we say ideological, geopolitical baggage to the side. That's the idea of them. Now, it was originally presented in Axios. This document was created by Witkoff and Dmitriev working together, right? I think that is a false. I think then the next version was that Witkoff created this together, possibly with Kushner, Jared Kushner, whoever the hell he is, Marco Rubio. Okay, that's more believable, because there's just so many things in this that Russia would never agree with. That's more believable. And so who is this K? All right, so the first one is it's Kirill Dmitriev that leaked it. The second one is it's Kellogg, that leaked it.
Who's on his way out? Right.
Yeah, who the next day was either fired and or resigned, depending on how you read it, and is obviously being replaced as the peace envoy to Ukraine, the babysitter to the Kiev regime. And Kellogg, even though Kellogg was still on the talk shows this weekend talking all of this down. So, so he announced that he's, deciding to spend more time with his family, that he never decided to stay very long with the Trump administration. So on. And it could be that he just hates what's being done with this plan, right? What's being proposed, that he sees it as giving up on the Kiev regime.
Which is my thought.
Yeah. Or it could be that he leaked it and has been punished and fired, right? And for not being on board. Who knows? Others have suggested that the K is Kushner, right? How Jared Kushner got involved in all of this, I don't know. But, I mean, in either way, this document, this 28 peace plan, at least the one that has been presented by this Ukrainian Rada member, right? And then, leaked by him, is, I mean, that's the definitive version, supposedly, that most people are working from, because at least it's a complete list of 28 things. Others have suggested that this is a Ukrainian rewrite on several of the measures from the original, and no one knows at this point. The Russians say that they haven't officially received anything yet, right? That they haven't received any peace plan, right? I'm sure they've examined what has been put out in the public sphere, and I'm sure they've got their intelligence, right, that tells them about this whole process. But according to them, they haven't even been presented with this. I have no doubt that whoever crafted it in the U.S., Witkoff and whoever else, that they probably, crafted it with some things that Kirill Dmitriev had talked about earlier in mind, right? But that's not it, right? Maybe that was Kirill Dmitriev said this. Yeah, we can add this as a sweetener, right? To sweeten the bitter pill for Russia going down, that, or maybe they even picked up the phone and said, hey, what do you think about this point, right? That's possible. That is possible, but there's no way that Russia at any point signed off on the document that in the form it is that we've seen, because there's way too much that Russia will never accept in this. That's important to keep in mind. Now, the latest out of the U.S. is that there were comments from U.S. senators that Marco Rubio had told them that the document was written by Russians. And then Rubio came out and denied that and says it was crafted by Americans. I'm going to be perfectly honest. This was not written by Russians.
No. God, no.
No. So that's a bit of propaganda meant to either people who genuinely believe it because it's so bad for Ukraine, although not near bad enough to meet Russia's demands, it must be said, or they're intentionally trying to slur it, right, to make it politically impossible for Trump to keep pushing it forward. That's a possibility as well. Now supposedly they're rewriting it with the EU and Kiev, although we don't know. Trump is tweeting about, there could be good things. We could be very close. It's not done until don't believe it until you see it, but it's almost done. Meanwhile, the Russians are like, the Westerners are fighting amongst themselves again, and we're not even in this process. And what Putin basically said, right? This is what he said, is that we are willing to take this document, right? Again, we haven't been officially presented it, but has been presented in the public sphere as a basis for talks. We could start with this, but no. I mean, we obviously couldn't accept this as it is, and Western media is just completely neglecting that, right? They're all just talking about how terrible it is for Ukraine, without even considering the fact that this doesn't they're presenting it as a maximalist list of Russian demands. Like, are you paying any attention?
Right, right.
This is so far a minimalist, element of Russian demands that Russia would not accept this. That is the reality, right? So again, we are living in two completely different realities still, and the Europeans have put forward their own quote unquote peace plan, which again is just the demand for a immediate unconditional ceasefire and non-acceptance of everything. This is a demand for a ceasefire, the Trump peace plan, a demand for a ceasefire with a few sweeteners tossed Russia's way, right? That's what it is. But Russia has said there will be no ceasefire until there's a final political settlement. Also, a number, just off the top of the head, some of the details that were presented in this Gun-Chorenko plan. 600,000, the Kiev regime's military is capped at 600,000. They don't have 600,000 now. They don't have it. They're lucky if they have half of that. I don't think they have half of that. So, I mean, that's, that's just absolutely absurd. And then these hedging statements that would seem to allow NATO state members to put their, if not NATO, right, to put their troops on the ground, something that the UK, Starmer, has already jumped on and is talking about British putting troops on the ground again. Obviously not acceptable to Russia, right? This is what they fought. They initiated this war in part to keep NATO troops out of Ukraine, right? Yeah. Exactly. So, I mean, and there's so many other things. The final decision,
nuclear power plant.
Kherson and Zaporozhye, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. In one version of it, at least something the Telegraph came out with, the British newspaper, that Donbass was going to be leased by Russia and paid. They're going to pay Ukraine to use the parts that they, the 79 or whatever percent that, they currently hold. It's just absolutely fantastic stuff. And so Putin said, we're willing to consider this as the basis for negotiations. But he also said, we're actually perfectly happy with the progress of our special military operation. And what he said, with that was our preferred solution at this point is on the battlefield, because then there's no ifs, ands, or buts. There's no quibbles. There's no going backs. It's reality on the ground, and you have to accept it. But we are willing to consider this as the basis for further talks, as the beginning of further talks, which is not the way the U.S. said. The Trump administration has no idea how to do diplomacy between great powers, right? It thinks everything is a backroom deal between the two big guys, a handshake in a smoke-filled room, and that settles everything. And that is not the way the U.S. and the Soviet Union did business, right? It's not the way you do business with great powers. Russia has repeatedly tried to push this whole process with the U.S. because ultimately, let's remember, this is not a negotiation between Russia and the Kiev regime in Ukraine. This is a negotiation on the settlement of a conflict between Russia and the United States. However, Trump might try to present it and his role in it otherwise. And the way things are settled between Russia and the U.S., and before that, the Soviet Union and the U.S., is a very big, protracted, highly teams of experts hashing out documents with every I and every T for extensive lengths of time, right? Real experts in the fields negotiating every fine detail, which is what it would be needed for a serious peace plan, a serious negotiation. Trump administration is just not capable of this. They're not capable of it mentally, and they don't have the professional chops to even begin to think of how to construct that document. They're a bunch of amateurs. They don't know what the hell they're doing. And this peace plan reflects that. If you read it, part of the language in there talking about all of this being legally binding. What the hell does that mean in international relations terms? Are you talking a UN Security Council resolution? But then again, the Minsk protocols were solidified in a UN Security Council resolution, and the U.S. wipes its rear end with UN Security Council resolutions as a regular basis. So that's not any, legally binding is a term that real estate developers would use in crypto,
right?
Which is what has happened here. So this is a non-starter, right? Now the game now becomes to try to twist this peace plan by the EU and the Kiev regime into such a form that they can pretend to agree with it without provoking a new civil war in the Kiev regime by the Banderites, by the ultra-nationalists who would never accept things like outright territorial concessions, right? In order to pass the buck on saying no to it to Russia. Because the way the timeline is presented, it's very suitable now for Russia because they don't have to worry about saying no on the presumption that Zelensky would never agree, to concessions of the territory and to never joining NATO and, all of these other things that, and by the way, the idea that they would never join NATO is what? Enshrined in the Ukrainian constitution? That was enshrined in the Ukrainian constitution already before the U.S. backed Putsch in 2014. So I don't see that as being acceptable by Russia, as enough of a guarantee for anything, right? A statement by the U.S., Trump saying, I pinky swear, at least until the next U.S. administration, that I won't push, no, that's not acceptable enough to Russia, right? The way Russia is concerned is that any diplomatic settlement has to be something that we can trust that the other side will fulfill, because otherwise we'll make it so on the battlefield. And quite honestly, I myself can't even conceive of what the Americans could do at this point to make the Russians trust anything that they sign their name to. I can't. After Minsk 1 and 2, after the February 21st agreement, after the U.S. pulled out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the short and intermediate range nuclear forces treaty, the open skies treaty, threatened to resume nuclear weapons. The JCPOA that Trump pulled out of as soon as Obama was out of all of this, and everything that's happened in the negotiations so far, where as far as the Russians are concerned, as Lavrov has now put out enough that they believed they had an understanding, not a deal, not an agreement, but an understanding coming out of Alaska. And then Trump came out of Alaska and turned around completely, and suddenly he was sending tomahawks and believed that the Ukraine could win it, right? And now a couple of months later, Trump, this is all happening, right? And this is a crucial point that I haven't iterated enough yet in this conversation. Why is this all being pushed now by the U.S. suddenly? A return to a peace settlement, or at least a ceasefire framed up as one, with a few sweeteners for Russia. Because the Kiev regime is crumbling all along the contact line, and they are afraid of an actual collapse, right?
Yes.
That's what the U.S. is suddenly desperately afraid of. That the Europeans are still absolutely living in fantasy land, right? And I have to say that most of the U.S. government or the U.S. regime is in the same place, right? This is not supported by Congress, by the House or the Senate. This is not supported by the U.S. intelligence community, the deep state, the blob, right? The Pentagon, whatever you want, to term the permanent bureaucracy. This is not accepted by the fourth estate, the media, right? Which has been an ideological driver, a whip cracker of this conflict from the very beginning. This is obviously not even acceptable to many people within the Trump administration, right? Kellogg, being walked away. Rubio is talking out the back of his hand against it at every opportunity from what, as far as what I can tell. And he's the U.S. Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, doing double duty somehow on that. The Europeans are vehemently against this, except for Orban and Fitzo, of course, right? And the Russians will never accept so many of the terms in this document. The only ones who want this quote unquote peace plan, right, this ceasefire ultimatum, is Trump and Witkoff, and I don't know, maybe Kushner. That's it. This is it in the water. There's no way. Someone is going to shoot this down, right? Or it's just going to collapse. The game, once again, as the last time we've been through this whole peace push process, is who is going to take the blame in Trump's mind, right? This is actually what's going on now, is maneuvering for Trump's twisted, febrile little mind, right, about who he blames that it's not going to work. That's the game right now. And the way the timeline is set up, it should be the Kiev regime, because it does make sense, right, that Donald Trump should get his own ducks, meaning his own people, the Europeans and the proxy Kiev regime, in line before he goes to negotiate with the Russians.
Agreed.
That's dumb. But they're going to try to wiggle out of that. They're going to try to get changes enough from a document that's already unacceptable to Russia, much less when they get through with it, so that Zelensky can pinky swear on it without causing a renewed civil conflict within the Maidan regime itself in Ukraine, and until Russia is forced to deny it. And again, if Zelensky signs something and then it's presented to Russia as the West united being behind this peace plan, Russia won't say no, right? They will drag it out. They will try to mire it in negotiations and teams, right, for months, for years, right, while they complete the SMO. And obviously the Europeans will start screaming immediately that Russia doesn't want peace, which, I mean, let's be frank. Everyone in this conflict, right, the Russians, the Americans, the Kiev regime, the Europeans, they all want peace on their terms.
Right.
They all don't want peace unless it's on their terms. And no one has definitively been defeated enough to force them to accept capitulation yet. And that's why ultimately this will continue on the battlefield. And the Russians are just happy with that right now. They're very happy with their progress. And I think I'm probably the analyst in the alt media that has, shall we say, been most cautious, right? Most, I would say, realist on the progress of Russia and this conflict. I know there were others who said it would all be over in 2 months, back in February of 2022, and have told us every 2 months since then that it will all be over in 2 months. Whereas my initial framing of this, that was that in one way or another, frozen conflict, guerrilla war, whatever, that this would be a forever war, right? That we would never see peace in Ukraine definitively, right, for any length of time during the rest of our lives. And I still stand by that. I still absolutely stand by that. And we're now going on 4 years in. I mean, I was the other alt media analysts, I don't name names, but specifically referring to comments I made a year and a half ago, more than a year and a half ago, said the idea that this conflict would still be going on in a year and a half ago, was ludicrous, and that I didn't understand logistics.
Somebody called you out. Somebody called you out.
Okay. So I'm calling them out. Somebody doesn't know logistics, but it's not me. But I am very positive right now. I don't believe the Kiev regime is going to collapse next week, right? Again, I don't like that big C word because I don't think it's going to happen that way. But they are crumbling all along the contact line. Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, Kupiansk, Liman, Seversk, Konstantinovka. Now the encirclement of Gulay Polya is progressing amazingly fast, faster than I think anyone realistically expected. They can't stop Russia anywhere, and Russia is progressing everywhere. It looks like even the forever battle in Volchansk in the Kharkov region is actually now won. Although, that they haven't made an official announcement. And let's be frank, Volchansk doesn't exist anymore. There's nothing there. There's no settlement left there. It's all just crumbled ruins of what was once buildings and so forth. And even in the Russian Ministry of Defense. But I'm extremely content with the way things are going now, and believing that Russia is winning definitively all over the contact line. And that is only going to speed up. It's only going to go faster from this point. And the Kiev regime is now not able to stop Russia anywhere. But previously, they were able to gather enough forces to stop Russia, or at least slow them down to a crawl in certain locations on the front that they particularly tried to hold, like Pokrovsk for, essentially, we can talk about how it was directly engaged, but in one form or another, Pokrovsk for a year, Volchansk for going on 2 years, right? Seversk right now, from essentially the beginning of the conflict, right, back in 2022. But all of those places, all of those last defense bastions are crumbling, and Russia's going to come out of this winter, right, with really the only thing going to be left in the Donbass in Kiev regime hands is Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And come the spring and early summer of next year, they're just going to roll over that like a tidal wave from multiple directions, coming down from the north, from Liman and Izium, coming from the east, coming from the south, even potentially coming around from the west. They're just going to be tidal waving over this last defensive line. And at the same time, they're pressing deep into Zaporozhye, into Dnipropetrovsk, into the north of Kharkov, right? And hey, I mean, there's even potential to reignite the Sumy front, right? So all of that is just, to me, it's the writing on the wall. Of course, they don't accept this, right? The words that an EU diplomat used to describe all of this, of the Trump regime, the Trump regime, forcing this quote unquote peace plan on Kiev, and the way they're talking about it, that sanctions have failed, right? According to no less than the Treasury Secretary Bennett, right? And that Russia is winning, and Vance saying that a Ukrainian victory is a fantasy. They said that the way this is being presented by the U.S. is, what did they say? Revolting? Was that the word they used?
Nauseating. It was nauseating.
Nauseating. Yeah, nauseating.
Driscoll,
Yeah. Okay. So yes, reality, I'm sure, is nauseating to the Europeans. That is what that is. But once again, all of this doesn't come close to meeting Russian minimalist demands from where they are right now. And that's why ultimately, even if, the US and, the Trump administration, the EU and the Kiev come out of this week with some type of united front, which doesn't look very united at the moment, whatever they come up with will still not be acceptable to Russia. So back to the conflict. The week of arguing about this diplomatically for the last week has been fun, but stop paying attention to this background noise and start paying more attention to what's happening on the battlefield, because ultimately that's where it's really important.
True.